Murder at the Wine Tasting Festival. Welcome to Mindful Musings, where we explore the quiet wisdom of observation and the intricate patterns of human nature through stories that warm the soul and sharpen the mind. I'm your host, William, and today we venture into a delicate world of fine wines and darker secrets. We'll be following the remarkable Miss Marple as she navigates the prestigious corridors of a wine festival where elegance masks murder. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. I read every single one of your messages. Now, let's settle in and discover what lies beneath the surface of this tangled mystery. Chapter 1. The Festival of Illusions. The Ashworth Wine Festival was the crown jewel of the English countryside, held annually in the elegant gardens of Ashworth Manor. Hundreds of wine enthusiasts from across Europe gathered for 3 days of tastings, lectures, and celebrations. It was the kind of event that brought prestige to the small village of Millbrook, nestled in the heart of the Cotswolds. The September weather had cooperated beautifully, with sunshine filtering through the ancient oak trees that lined the festival grounds. Miss Jane Marple had been invited by her friend Lady Ashworth, who had been hosting the festival for the past decade. Despite her advancing years, Miss Marple had always found wine festivals rather fascinating, not for the wine itself, though she appreciated a good sherry, but for the people who gathered around it. In her experience, human nature revealed itself most candidly when people believed themselves to be in sophisticated company, when they thought their pretenses were justified by circumstance. She wore her usual sensible cardigan and a pearl brooch, carrying a small notebook in her handbag, not because she intended to take notes, but because she had found that writing things down helped her remember the intricate details that others so often overlooked. Her sharp blue eyes took in everything as she walked through the festival grounds, observing the careful arrangements, the nervous staff, and most importantly, the people. The central tent was magnificent, with long tables draped in white linen and arranged in perfect rows. Each table held dozens of glasses, organized by region and vintage, with small placards describing the wines in flowery language. At the far end of the tent stood a raised platform where the festival's most prestigious tastings would take place. It was here that the featured event would occur on the final evening, a blind tasting of rare vintages from private collections. Miss Marple settled herself at one of the smaller tasting stations where the wines were more modest, watching the crowds shift and flow like currents in a river. She had always believed that one learned more by observing than by participating. Next to her stood a woman of perhaps 40, impeccably dressed in a designer dress that cost more than Miss Marple's entire wardrobe, with perfectly styled dark hair and an air of professional confidence. This was Victoria Hammond, the sommelier who had been featured extensively in the festival's promotional materials. Victoria Hammond was elegant and knowledgeable, moving through the crowd with an ease that spoke of years spent in refined circles. She spoke with a London accent, slightly accentuated, and had a habit of using French terms liberally when discussing wines, which impressed many of the festival attendees, but which Miss Marple observed with a certain scepticism. There was something about Miss Hammond's smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a quality that suggested her warmth was a performance rather than a genuine expression. Across the tent, Miss Marple noticed a man in his 60s, weathered and bronzed from outdoor work, moving with visible discomfort through the crowd. This was James Whitmore, owner of Whitmore Vineyard, one of the most respected wineries in the region. He had been featured in the festival's opening ceremony, and yet something in his demeanour suggested that he did not truly wish to be here. His jaw was set tight, and his eyes followed Victoria Hammond with an intensity that went beyond casual observation. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with several festival attendees. A wealthy businessman from London discussed the investment potential of rare wines. A restaurant owner from Exeter spoke enthusiastically about the wines he planned to purchase for his establishment. An elderly wine collector from Bath reminisced about vintages he had tasted decades ago. Through these conversations, a pattern began to emerge in Miss Marple's mind, though she could not yet articulate what it was. It was Lady Ashworth who mentioned something curious as they stood together observing the crowds. "You know, Jane," she said, lowering her voice slightly, I've heard the most extraordinary rumours about Victoria Hammond. Some of the wine merchants have been whispering that certain very rare bottles that have appeared on the market recently have come from her private collection, and yet the provenance seems rather vague. The dealers in London are apparently quite concerned about the authenticity of some recent acquisitions. Miss Marple considered this information carefully. In her long experience, rumours often contained kernels of truth, though the kernels were often surrounded by layers of misinterpretation and exaggeration. Still, it was interesting that Miss Hammond's name had come up in connection with questions of authenticity. Wine fraud was not uncommon, though it required a certain boldness of character that Miss Marple had observed in some of the least likely people. That evening there was a grand reception in the manor itself, where the festival's patrons mingled with local dignitaries and wine experts. The drawing-room was resplendent with fresh flowers and silver trays of canapes, and several bottles of fine wine were opened for the occasion. Miss Marple observed Victoria Hammond working the room with practised charm, engaging in animated conversations with wealthy collectors and restaurant owners. She saw the sommelier present several bottles as recommendations, and noted with interest that the wealthy patrons seemed predisposed to purchase whatever she suggested. James Whitmore stood apart from the festivities, nursing a glass of water and watching the proceedings with an expression that suggested he was enduring rather than enjoying the evening. When his eyes met those of Victoria Hammond across the room, something passed between them, a recognition of enmity that was quickly masked when others noticed. As Miss Marple prepared to retire for the evening, she found herself in conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Carlyle, the wife of a prominent restaurant owner who had come to the festival to purchase wines for their establishment. Eleanor was a woman of perhaps 50, with intelligent eyes and a manner that suggested she was more observant than most of the other attendees. As they stood in the hallway, Eleanor confided in Miss Marple in the way that women sometimes do when they sense a kindred spirit. "I've worked in restaurants for my entire adult life," Eleanor said, "and I've learned to recognise when something is not quite right. The wines that Miss Hammond has been recommending to my husband, they taste exceptional, but something about them troubles me. The price points seem too good, and when I've attempted to verify the provenance with the supposed vineyards, the information is often vague or difficult to obtain." Miss Marple listened with great interest. She had found that the most valuable information often came from people like Eleanor Carlyle, practical people who spent their lives in close observation of their professions. It was the poets and dreamers and idealists, she had observed, who often missed the most obvious truths. As the evening ended and Miss Marple returned to her room in the manor, she found herself thinking about the threads that connected the people she had observed. There was Victoria Hammond with her practised charm and her mysterious wine collection. There was James Whitmore with his evident bitterness and his evident pain. There were the restaurant owners and wine collectors, all seeking authentication and prestige through bottles of supposedly rare vintage. And there was the fundamental human desire to believe that one was purchasing something rare and valuable, to believe that one had access to something that others did not. She sat at her writing desk and made a few notes in her small notebook. Not conclusions, but observations. Questions that needed answering. The origins of Miss Hammond's rare wines. The precise nature of the dispute between Miss Hammond and Mr. Whitmore. The question of why a woman of Miss Hammond's obvious intelligence and capability would engage in wine fraud, when surely she had the ability to build a legitimate reputation. The next day would bring the preliminary tastings, and the day after, the grand blind tasting at the festival's conclusion. As Miss Marple prepared for sleep, she felt that familiar tingle of curiosity, the sense that the puzzle before her was not as simple as it appeared, that the surface smoothness concealed depths that would require careful exploration to understand. Chapter 2. The Sommelier's Secret. The second day of the festival began with a series of masterclasses, during which various wine experts discussed the intricacies of specific regions and vintages. Victoria Hammond conducted one of the most well-attended sessions, speaking with authoritative confidence about the wines of Bordeaux and the factors that contributed to the exceptional quality of certain vintages. She was undeniably knowledgeable, and her presentation was polished and engaging. However, Miss Marple, who had attended the masterclass out of genuine curiosity, noticed something interesting. When Miss Hammond spoke about specific wines that she claimed had come from her personal collection, she occasionally hesitated before providing details about their provenance. These hesitations were brief, quickly masked by a sip of water or a pause for effect, but they were noticeable to someone who was paying careful attention. After the masterclass concluded, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Michael Prescott, the festival's wine director, and the person responsible for organising the blind tasting that would conclude the festival. Michael was a pleasant man in his mid-50s, knowledgeable about wine, but also, Miss Marple observed, rather easy to influence. He clearly had great admiration for Victoria Hammond's expertise and had deferred to her judgment on several matters regarding the selection of wines for the final tasting. "I understand that Miss Hammond has been instrumental in selecting several of the bottles for tomorrow evening's blind tasting," Miss Marple mentioned conversationally. "One assumes that such selections come with the full documentation of provenance and authenticity." Michael seemed slightly uncomfortable at the question. "Well, Victoria has such excellent connections," he said. "She was able to secure some truly exceptional pieces, bottles that would have been extremely difficult for us to obtain otherwise. For a blind tasting, of course, the provenance matters less than the quality of the wine itself. The whole point is that the tasters are evaluating the wines without any prior knowledge of their identity or supposed rarity." Miss Marple accepted this explanation while simultaneously recognizing its flaws. In her experience, when someone provided a reasonable but incomplete answer to a direct question, it was usually because the complete answer would have revealed something problematic. She made a mental note to investigate the bottles that Miss Hammond had contributed to the final tasting more carefully. That afternoon, while exploring the Manor's wine storage facilities under the pretext of looking for a particular vintage that Lady Ashworth had mentioned, Miss Marple discovered something intriguing. In one of the temperature-controlled rooms where the festival's wines were being stored, several bottles were arranged on a shelf with labels that appeared to be relatively new, though the bottles themselves were old. The discrepancy was subtle, something that most people would not have noticed, but Miss Marple had spent years observing the small imperfections that revealed when someone was attempting to deceive. She examined several of the bottles more carefully, looking at the labels, the seals, and the condition of the glass itself. The bottles themselves were authentic, this much was clear, but the labels had been replaced, and recently. The handwriting on several of them was similar in style, though it attempted to vary slightly in pressure and angle, the kind of variation that a skilled forger might introduce to avoid detection. It was at this point that Miss Marple made the connection between the information that Eleanor Carlyle had shared and the evidence before her eyes. Victoria Hammond was not merely recommending wines of questionable provenance. She was actively creating false provenances, relabeling bottles of ordinary wine with the names and years of rare and expensive vintages, and then selling these fraudulent bottles to restaurants and collectors at premium prices. The question that remained was how extensive the fraud had become, how many bottles had been mislabeled, and how many people had been deceived. But more importantly, Miss Marple wondered about the financial incentive. Surely Miss Hammond was already successful, already wealthy. Why would she engage in such a risky enterprise unless the financial reward was substantial, or unless there were other motivations at work? She was still pondering these questions when she encountered James Whitmore in one of the Manor's hallways. He appeared to be looking for something, moving with purpose but also with a certain furtiveness that suggested he did not wish to be observed. When he noticed Miss Marple, he attempted to mask his expression with a polite smile, though it was clear that his mind was occupied with matters of considerable importance. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe we have not been formally introduced," Miss Marple said gently. "I am Jane Marple. I am a guest of Lady Ashworth's, and I have long admired the wines of Whitmore Vineyard." This seemed to please him, and he introduced himself with somewhat more warmth than he had shown at the reception the previous evening. They fell into conversation about viticulture, and Miss Marple found that Mr. Whitmore was a fascinating conversationalist when the topic turned to his profession. He spoke about the soil composition of his vineyard, the weather patterns that affected the grapes, and the specific techniques that had been passed down through his family for generations. However, when Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward the festival and toward Victoria Hammond, Mr. Whitmore's demeanour changed immediately. His face darkened, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He clearly wished to say something, but he restrained himself, taking a moment to compose his thoughts before speaking. "That woman," he said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "has done more damage to my reputation, and the reputation of my family's vineyard, than I would have thought possible. She has associated my name with fraudulent wines, has claimed that bottles bearing my vineyard's label are part of her personal collection, has permitted collectors to believe that wines I did not produce are products of Whitmore Vineyard. The damage to my reputation in the market has been substantial." Miss Marple listened with great care, and as Mr. Whitmore spoke, the pattern began to clarify further. Victoria Hammond had apparently been purchasing inexpensive wines from various producers and relabeling them with the names of prestigious vineyards, including Whitmore Vineyard. She had been selling these fraudulent bottles to restaurants and collectors at prices that reflected the supposed rarity and prestige of the wines. The fraud had become substantial enough that when wine merchants and collectors had begun to investigate the authenticity of their purchases, questions had been raised about the vineyards themselves. James Whitmore had discovered the fraud when a prominent collector had purchased a bottle supposedly from his vineyard, but which he had never produced. The subsequent investigation had revealed not only the false labelling, but also the association of his vineyard's name with these fraudulent bottles. His reputation, carefully built over decades, had been damaged, and his sales had declined as collectors became wary of purchasing wines bearing the Whitmore name. "And what have you done about it, Mr. Whitmore?" Miss Marple asked carefully. "Have you contacted the authorities?" He shook his head bitterly. "The evidence is difficult to establish definitively. The bottles she is using are real enough. She is simply placing false labels on them, and proving that she knew the labels were false, proving her intent to defraud, rather than merely making an innocent mistake. This is more complicated than it might appear. My solicitor has suggested that a legal action might prove costly and time-consuming, with an uncertain outcome. She is a clever woman, Miss Marple. Very clever indeed." As Mr. Whitmore left to continue whatever search had occupied him, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychological dimensions of the situation. Victoria Hammond had perpetrated an extensive fraud. James Whitmore's reputation and livelihood had been damaged as a result. Both of these people were present at the festival, which would culminate in a grand blind tasting that would be attended by many of the wine world's most influential figures. She began to wonder what might happen if someone were to expose the fraud at such a public venue, before such an important audience. The scandal would be catastrophic for Victoria Hammond's reputation. She would face legal consequences, financial ruin, and professional disgrace. And James Whitmore, if the extent of his knowledge of the fraud became public, might be implicated in some way, might be suspected of having collaborated in the scheme or of having remained silent about it. That evening, Miss Marple made inquiries about Victoria Hammond's background, speaking casually with various festival attendees who might have known her professionally or personally. She learned that Miss Hammond had come relatively recently to prominence in the wine world, that she had appeared about 5 years ago with an impressive collection of rare wines and a confident manner that had quickly earned her a reputation as an expert. Before that, her history was somewhat vague, though it appeared that she had worked in restaurants and wine bars in London, gradually building her knowledge and her connections. It was Eleanor Carlyle who provided the most interesting information. She mentioned that she had encountered Victoria Hammond several years ago, when Miss Hammond had been working as a sommelier at a prestigious restaurant in Knightsbridge. The two women had not been close, but Eleanor remembered Miss Hammond as being ambitious and clever, but also frustrated by her salary and position. She had spoken frequently about wanting to establish herself as an independent consultant, about building her own business in which she would not be limited by the bureaucratic structures of restaurant employment. The pieces were beginning to fall into place in Miss Marple's mind. Victoria Hammond had perhaps begun innocently enough, recommending rare wines from supposedly obscure sources to wealthy collectors. But as her reputation had grown, the demand for her recommendations had increased, and the prices that people were willing to pay had become substantial. Perhaps the fraud had begun as a way to meet this demand, to provide bottles that matched the descriptions and the prestige that her clients were seeking. What remained unclear was precisely when Mr. Whitmore had discovered the extent of the fraud and what his reaction had been. She had observed the enmity between them, but she had not yet determined whether Mr. Whitmore's presence at the festival was coincidental or intentional, whether he had come seeking revenge or merely seeking to salvage his reputation by being present at an important event. As Miss Marple prepared for sleep on the second night of the festival, she found herself considering the implications of the grand blind tasting that would take place on the following evening. Several of the bottles that Victoria Hammond had selected for the tasting were likely to be fraudulent, mislabeled bottles that would not match the descriptions that had been provided. When this became apparent during the blind tasting, when professional wine tasters compared the wines they were tasting with the descriptions that had been provided, the fraud would be exposed publicly before a room full of witnesses. The question was not whether the fraud would be exposed, but rather what would happen as a result. What would Victoria Hammond do when her deception was revealed? How would James Whitmore react? And what might occur in the hours and days immediately following the exposure of such an extensive and lucrative fraud? Chapter 3. The Tangled Threads. The morning of the final day of the festival dawned with a sense of anticipation. The grand blind tasting was scheduled for the evening, and it had been heavily promoted as the highlight of the festival, an event that would bring together some of the most respected palates in the wine world. Collectors, restaurant owners, wine merchants, and critics had all registered to participate, and the event had become something of a spectacle, with photographs planned for wine magazines and press releases prepared for the media. Miss Marple spent the morning reviewing her observations and considering what she knew about the situation. She had confirmed that several of the bottles selected by Victoria Hammond for the blind tasting were mislabeled. She had learned about the extent of the fraud and the damage it had caused to James Whitmore's reputation. She had observed the clear animosity between the two of them, and she had noted that Mr. Whitmore had appeared to be searching for something in the manor the previous day, a search that seemed intentional and purposeful. What she had not yet determined was the precise nature of Mr. Whitmore's intentions. Was he simply seeking to verify his suspicions about the fraud, or was he planning something more elaborate, some form of revenge that would extend beyond merely allowing the fraud to be exposed? In Miss Marple's experience, people who had been wronged often contemplated actions that went far beyond the rational, actions that were driven by anger and a desire for retribution rather than by any practical consideration. She decided that she needed to examine the wines that would be used in the blind tasting more carefully. With Lady Ashworth's permission, she arranged to visit the storage facility where the bottles were being kept. Michael Prescott, the festival's wine director, was there overseeing the selection and arrangement of the bottles that would be used for the tasting. He seemed somewhat surprised by Miss Marple's interest, but he was willing to accommodate her request, explaining the organisation of the tasting and the specific bottles that had been selected. As they reviewed the bottles, Miss Marple noted their labels, their seals, and the handwriting of the information that had been written on each bottle by Michael himself. She was particularly interested in the bottles that Victoria Hammond had selected, and she found that, as she had suspected, several of them bore labels that were distinctly suspicious, labels that showed signs of being relatively recently applied. One bottle in particular caught her attention. It was labelled as a 1947 Chateau Lafite Rothschild, supposedly from a private collection that Victoria Hammond had recently acquired. The label itself was exceptional in its appearance, and if one was not paying very careful attention, it would appear to be entirely authentic. However, Miss Marple could see the subtle signs of forgery, the way the ink had been applied slightly differently, the way the aging of the label did not quite match the aging of the bottle itself. She asked Michael when this particular bottle had been received, and he consulted his records, indicating that Victoria Hammond had delivered it personally just 2 days before the festival began. He had not personally examined it in great detail, as he had trusted Miss Hammond's expertise and her assurance that the provenance was entirely authentic. Miss Marple then asked a question that seemed casual, but which was actually quite pointed. Has anyone attempted to tamper with any of the bottles since they arrived at the manor? Has anyone had access to the storage facility who should not have had access? Michael seemed slightly defensive at this question, but he assured her that the storage facility was kept locked, that only he had a key, and that no one had tampered with the bottles as far as he was aware. The facility was climate-controlled and secure, and he took great pride in the fact that the wines were being stored under optimal conditions. Miss Marple thanked him for his assistance and left the storage facility with much to consider. She was now fairly certain about the fraud, but she was also beginning to form suspicions about what might be about to occur. The blind tasting would proceed as planned, the fraudulent bottles would be identified, and the fraud would be exposed. But, unless she was very much mistaken, someone was planning to do something far more dramatic than simply allow the truth to be revealed through normal channels. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with James Whitmore. She found him in the Manor's library, apparently reading, though his attention seemed distant and his thoughts elsewhere. She asked if they might speak privately, and he seemed wary but willing to accommodate her request. They sat in a quiet corner of the library, away from the possibility of being overheard. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe you have reason to believe that Victoria Hammond has engaged in extensive wine fraud," Miss Marple began without preamble. "I also believe that this fraud has caused you considerable damage, both financially and professionally. Is this assessment accurate?" Mr. Whitmore seemed startled by her directness, but he nodded slowly. "Yes, Miss Marple, that is accurate. She has destroyed my reputation and the reputation of my family's vineyard through her fraudulent schemes. And I further believe that you are aware that several of the bottles that Miss Hammond has selected for tonight's blind tasting are fraudulent, mislabeled wines that will be exposed as such when they are subjected to expert tasting and analysis." Again, Mr. Whitmore nodded, though now he seemed concerned about where Miss Marple's questions were leading. "The question that troubles me, Mr. Whitmore, is whether you are simply planning to allow this exposure to occur naturally, or whether you are planning to take some more direct action. I ask this because I have observed you searching through the manor, and I have observed an intensity in your demeanour that suggests you are preparing for something beyond merely being present when the fraud is exposed." Mr. Whitmore was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Whatever I may have been contemplating, Miss Marple, the exposure of the fraud would be sufficient satisfaction for me. To see Victoria Hammond's reputation destroyed, to see her face the consequences of her actions, this is all that I require." Miss Marple studied him carefully, attempting to determine whether he was being truthful with her. She had spent many years observing human nature, and she had learned to recognize when someone was speaking truth and when they were being evasive. Mr. Whitmore's response seemed genuine, but she was not entirely convinced that his statement represented his complete thoughts or his complete intentions. "I must tell you, Mr. Whitmore, that I believe the truth about the fraud will emerge this evening during the blind tasting. Victoria Hammond will be exposed, and the consequences will be severe for her. I would strongly caution you against taking any action that might complicate matters or that might result in harm to yourself or to others. Whatever damage has been done, it can be addressed through proper legal channels, through the authorities and the courts." He seemed to appreciate her concern, though he did not make any explicit promise to refrain from any particular action. As Miss Marple left the library, she found herself hoping that her assessment of Mr. Whitmore's character was accurate, that he was fundamentally a man of principle who would not allow his anger to drive him toward truly reckless behaviour. The hours until the blind tasting began were consumed with preparation. The manor was transformed into an elegant venue for the event, with the main dining hall arranged with long tables where the tasters would be seated. Professional tasting glasses were set out, note sheets were arranged, and the bottles to be tasted were placed in positions where they could be served without their labels being visible to the tasters. Michael Prescott moved about with nervous energy, making final adjustments and ensuring that everything was precisely as it should be. Victoria Hammond appeared in the dining hall in the late afternoon, dressed in an elegant black gown that suggested she was treating the evening as a significant occasion. She seemed confident and composed, offering helpful suggestions about the arrangement of the bottles and the order in which they should be tasted. As the dinner hour approached and the guests began to arrive, Miss Marple found herself observing the faces of the people who had come for the blind tasting. There were collectors whose fortunes had been built on the assumption that they were purchasing authentic, rare wines. There were restaurant owners who had purchased bottles on Victoria Hammond's recommendations and who had served them to their customers under the belief that they were genuine. There were wine merchants who had handled the bottles in their dealings with clients, and there was James Whitmore, standing somewhat apart from the others, his expression carefully neutral. The blind tasting began promptly at 7 o'clock, with Michael Prescott explaining the procedures and introducing the panel of expert tasters who would be evaluating the wines. The first bottles were served, and the tasters bent over their glasses, examining the wines, tasting them, and making notes on their evaluation sheets. The atmosphere in the room was one of intense concentration, with little conversation, only the soft sounds of glasses being set down, pencils moving across paper, and the occasional murmur of discussion. It was with the fifth wine that something went distinctly wrong. One of the professional tasters, a woman named Catherine Ashford, who was recognized as one of the leading palates in the international wine world, had taken a sip from her glass and had immediately set it down with an expression of alarm. She had turned to Michael Prescott and had begun speaking to him urgently, her voice too quiet for others to hear, clearly, but her demeanor indicating that something was seriously amiss. The tasting was interrupted momentarily, and Michael seemed to be asking questions about the wine, about its provenance and its source. Catherine Ashford was examining her glass more carefully, and she appeared to have detected something in the wine that was deeply concerning to her. She requested to taste the wine again, and after doing so, she turned to Michael with a very serious expression. "This wine is not what it is purported to be," she said loudly enough for others to hear, "and more troublingly, it appears to contain something quite dangerous. This is not a matter of mislabeling. This appears to be deliberately contaminated. There is a chemical smell that I recognize, methanol rather than ethanol. This wine could cause serious illness, or worse, to anyone who consumed it." A commotion erupted in the dining hall. Other tasters began examining their glasses. The event organizers seemed panicked, and voices were raised in alarm and confusion. Michael Prescott was attempting to establish order, while Victoria Hammond had gone very pale, apparently realizing that something catastrophic was unfolding. It was at this point that a voice cut through the chaos, a voice that was strained and anguished. James Whitmore stepped forward, his face contorted with emotion, and he spoke in a loud and clear voice. "That is my wine," he said. "The wine that Miss Ashford has tasted, the wine that has been poisoned, that is a bottle from Whitmore Vineyard, labelled with my name and my vineyard's reputation. This is what Victoria Hammond has done to me. She has taken my good name, and she has used it for her frauds, and now someone has used my reputation to poison wine that will be served at this festival." The implications of his words seemed to strike everyone simultaneously. The wine that contained methanol was not merely a mislabeled bottle. It was a poisoned bottle, deliberately contaminated with a substance that could cause severe harm or death to anyone who consumed it. And it had been served at the blind tasting, where it had been tasted by professional wine experts, any one of whom could have consumed a significant quantity before the contamination was detected. Miss Marple observed the reactions of the people around her. She saw Victoria Hammond's shock and her apparent horror at the revelation of the poisoning. She saw Michael Prescott's distress at the realization that poisoned wine had been served at his carefully organized event. She saw James Whitmore's apparent anguish at the discovery that his vineyard's name had been associated not merely with fraud, but with attempted poisoning. And she saw something else, something that troubled her deeply, something that suggested that the situation was far more complex and far more dangerous than even she had initially understood. As she studied the faces around her, as she observed the reactions and the statements being made, she began to form a hypothesis about what had truly occurred, about who had deliberately contaminated the wine, and about the motivations that might have driven someone to commit such a potentially catastrophic act. Chapter 4. The Midnight Investigation. After the chaos of the evening had subsided and the authorities had been called to remove the poisoned wine, the manor had become a scene of confusion and disruption. The blind tasting had been abandoned, the guests were in a state of shock, and the police had begun preliminary investigations into the nature of the poisoning and how the contaminated wine had come to be included in the tasting. Inspector David Carlton, a serious man from the local police force, had taken charge of the investigation. He had secured the poisoned bottle as evidence and had begun taking statements from those who had been present at the tasting. The atmosphere at the manor had shifted dramatically from elegant celebration to something far darker, something that suggested that a serious crime had been committed, perhaps attempted murder. Miss Marple had given her statement to Inspector Carlton, providing him with observations about the evening's events, though she had carefully avoided making any accusations or presenting her theories about who might have been responsible for the poisoning. When asked if she had any suspicions about the source of the contaminated wine, she had replied that she believed the matter would become clearer as more information was gathered. Late that evening, after most of the guests had retired to their rooms, Miss Marple found herself unable to sleep. She sat by her window in her room at the manor, her mind working through the events of the day and considering what they meant. She needed to examine the storage facility more carefully, needed to determine exactly when the wine had been poisoned, and by whom. She had observed something during the chaos of the evening that had struck her as significant. When James Whitmore had stepped forward to claim that the poisoned wine was from his vineyard, his expression had been one of anguish, but also something else, something that might have been calculated. She had seen the way his eyes had moved to Victoria Hammond's face as he made his statement, the way he had seemed to be observing her reaction with great interest. At midnight, when she believed the manor to be quiet, Miss Marple dressed herself and made her way downstairs. She had a key to the wine storage facility, borrowed earlier with Lady Ashworth's permission under the pretext of retrieving a particular bottle for a personal tasting. She descended the stairs carefully, moving quietly to avoid drawing attention to herself. The storage facility was dark when she arrived, and she used a small torch to navigate her way among the temperature-controlled shelves. She began examining the bottles more carefully, looking for signs of tampering, for any indication of when. The wine might have been contaminated. The facility had been locked, as Michael Prescott had asserted, but she found herself considering the question of who might have had access to the keys. She was so absorbed in her examination that she did not immediately notice that she was no longer alone. It was only when she heard a sound behind her that she realized someone else had entered the facility. She turned to see Victoria Hammond standing in the doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Miss Marple," Victoria said, her voice shaking slightly. "I saw you come down here. I need to speak with you. I need to tell you the truth about what has happened." They stood among the bottles, in the cool of the storage facility, and Victoria Hammond began to speak. Her words came in a rush, as if she had been holding them back and could no longer bear to do so. She confessed to the wine fraud, to relabeling cheap wines with false labels and selling them to collectors and restaurants at inflated prices. She described how the fraud had begun, how she had fallen into it gradually, driven by ambition and the desire to establish herself as an expert without having the resources to do so legitimately. "The fraud was wrong," she said, "and I have known it was wrong all along. But I cannot confess to the poisoning, Miss Marple, because I did not do it. I swear to you I did not contaminate that wine with methanol. When I discovered that someone had done so, when I realized that a poisoned bottle was among the wines for the blind tasting, I was horrified. I had no desire to harm anyone, whatever my financial improprieties may have been." Miss Marple studied the woman's face, attempting to determine whether she was being truthful. Victoria's distress seemed genuine, and her assertion that she had not poisoned the wine rang true, at least in the sense that Victoria apparently believed what she was saying. But Miss Marple was beginning to form a different hypothesis about what had occurred, a hypothesis that involved multiple deceptions layered upon one another. "Who do you believe poisoned the wine, Miss Hammond?" Miss Marple asked gently. Victoria seemed to struggle with this question, her eyes moving away from Miss Marple's face. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I fear that it might be James Whitmore. He has reason to hate me. I have damaged his reputation, and he has confronted me several times about the fraud. When I arrived at the manor this morning, I found a note in my room, unsigned, that said something terrible would happen today, that I would face consequences for what I had done." Miss Marple considered this information carefully. A threatening note was certainly relevant, though it did not definitively prove that Mr. Whitmore was responsible for the poisoning. It was possible that someone else had sent the note, that someone had attempted to frame Mr. Whitmore, or that the situation was even more complex than she was beginning to understand. "You must confess to the wine fraud," Miss Marple said firmly. "The authorities will discover it eventually in any case, and your confession will carry more weight if you come forward voluntarily. As for the poisoning, let me investigate that matter further. I believe I may have some insights that will help clarify what has truly occurred." Victoria agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to confess to the fraud when she was questioned again by the authorities. After she had left the storage facility, Miss Marple continued her examination of the wine bottles. She was looking for something specific now, a bottle that had been contaminated and then replaced with another bottle, or some other indication of precisely when and how the poisoning had occurred. She found what she was looking for on a shelf near the back of the facility. There was a bottle of ordinary red wine, clearly inexpensive, sitting among bottles that were supposed to be rare and valuable. The bottle was dusty, suggesting it had been there for some time, and it bore no label. Next to it was a space where another bottle should have been, a space that was conspicuously empty. Miss Marple realized that what had occurred was precisely what she had suspected. The poisoned wine had not been among the wines that Victoria Hammond had selected for the blind tasting. Rather, the poisoned wine had been substituted for one of the bottles that Victoria had selected. Someone had removed a bottle from the storage facility and had replaced it with a bottle that contained methanol instead of the promised vintage. The question was who had done this, and for what purpose. As Miss Marple stood in the storage facility, examining the evidence before her, she heard footsteps approaching. She quickly concealed herself behind a stack of wine boxes, dimming her torch, and waited to see who else would visit the storage facility in the middle of the night. Chapter 5. The Poisoned Vintage. It was James Whitmore who entered the storage facility, moving with the careful quietness of someone who did not wish to be discovered. He made directly for the shelf where Miss Marple had been examining the bottles, clearly knowing precisely where he was going. He seemed surprised to find the bottles exactly as they had been, as if he had expected to find something different, something that suggested his plan had been discovered or interfered with. He retrieved a small bottle from inside his jacket, a bottle that appeared to contain some kind of chemical liquid. He held it up to the light, examining it carefully, and his expression suggested that he was attempting to make some decision about whether to proceed with whatever plan he had been contemplating. Miss Marple emerged from her hiding place and spoke to him in a quiet but firm voice. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe you have some explaining to do. I have reason to believe that you are responsible for the poisoning of the wine that was served at this evening's tasting. I further believe that your actions tonight suggest you were planning additional tampering with the wine bottles." James Whitmore turned to face her, and his expression shifted rapidly from shock to something that might have been resignation. He set down the bottle he had been holding and sat heavily on a nearby box, as if all the anger and tension that had been driving him had suddenly drained away. "You are correct, Miss Marple," he said, his voice hollow. "I did poison the wine, and I was planning to poison another bottle to ensure that the contamination would be discovered, that the fraud would be exposed not merely as a matter of mislabeling, but as something far more sinister. I believed that if I could demonstrate the extent of Victoria Hammond's deception and recklessness, the authorities would prosecute her more aggressively, that she would face serious criminal charges rather than merely civil penalties." "But that is not the entire truth, is it, Mr. Whitmore?" Miss Marple asked. Gently. "I believe your motivations are more complex than that. I believe that you did not merely wish to expose Victoria Hammond's fraud. I believe that you wish to cause her harm, to destroy her reputation and her freedom, as she has destroyed yours." James Whitmore said nothing for a long moment, but his silence was confirmation enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was bitter and anguished. "She destroyed everything, Miss Marple. My family's reputation, my business, my ability to sell my wines." Collectors and restaurants began to avoid Whitmore wines because they feared that what they were purchasing was fraudulent. Sales declined dramatically. My employees, people who had worked for my family for decades, had to be let go. I was on the verge of losing everything. "And you believed that poisoning wine with methanol was a proportionate response to this situation?" Miss Marple asked. "You believed that it was appropriate to potentially harm innocent people to endanger the lives of professional wine tasters who had done nothing to you to create a dangerous situation that could have resulted in serious injury or death. The harshness of her words seemed to strike him forcefully. He looked down at his hands, and tears began to stream down his face. "No," he said. "No. When I think about it clearly, when I hear it stated in such terms, I realize that what I was planning to do was evil. It was wrong. But I have been so angry, Miss Marple, and I did not know how else to make her pay for what she has done." It was at this point that Miss Marple realized something crucial, something that changed her understanding of the situation entirely. She looked at the bottle that James Whitmore had set down on the box beside him, and she examined its label more carefully. It was methanol, certainly, but the bottle itself bore markings that suggested it was not simply a chemical purchased for the purpose of poisoning wine. It appeared to be a professional-grade chemical, the kind that might be used in industrial processes or in scientific research. "Mr. Whitmore," Miss Marple said carefully, "where did you obtain this methanol? Did you purchase it yourself, or did someone provide it to you?" He seemed confused by the question, and he admitted that he had obtained it from a supplier, that he had represented himself as needing it for some cleaning purposes related to his vineyard operations. But as he described the purchase in more detail, Miss Marple began to suspect that someone else had perhaps encouraged him to make this purchase, had perhaps provided him with suggestions about how to obtain the chemical and how to introduce it into the wine. She was developing a new theory about what had occurred, a theory that suggested that James Whitmore had been manipulated into poisoning the wine, that someone else had been orchestrating events to create precisely the situation that had unfolded. But before she could pursue this line of questioning further, they heard the sound of the storage facility door opening again. Inspector Carlton appeared in the doorway, his expression stern, and behind him were 2 police officers. He had apparently been alerted to some unusual activity in the storage facility and had come to investigate. He observed James Whitmore sitting on the box with the methanol bottle beside him, and he observed Miss Marple standing nearby, and he quickly drew his own conclusions about what was occurring. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, "before you draw any hasty conclusions, I believe there is more to this situation than what it may initially appear. Mr. Whitmore has confessed to poisoning the wine, but I believe he has been manipulated into doing so by someone else, someone who had every reason to wish for both Mr. Whitmore and Miss Hammond to be destroyed." Inspector Carlton seemed sceptical of this assertion, but he was willing to listen to what Miss Marple had to say. As she explained her developing theory, as she outlined the evidence that suggested a third party had been orchestrating events, the inspector's expression gradually shifted from skepticism to serious concern. Chapter 6. The Web of Deception. After James Whitmore had been taken into custody, and the poisoned methanol bottle had been secured as evidence, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Inspector Carlton. They withdrew to Lady Ashworth's study, where they could speak without being overheard, and Miss Marple began to outline her theory about what had truly occurred. "I believe," she said, "that we must expand our investigation beyond James Whitmore and Victoria Hammond. I believe there is a third party involved in this matter, someone who has been manipulating events from the background, someone who had motivation to harm both of them simultaneously." The inspector looked puzzled. "But Miss Marple," he said, "we have evidence that Whitmore poisoned the wine. We have his own confession. What possible motivation could anyone else have to engage in such complex manipulation?" Miss Marple explained her reasoning carefully. She described the fact that the poisoned bottle had not come from Victoria Hammond's collection, but rather had been substituted in the storage facility. She explained that James Whitmore's knowledge of the poisoning seemed to have been sudden and recent, as if someone had suggested the idea to him shortly before the festival. She outlined the threatening note that Victoria Hammond had received, a note that had clearly been designed to make her appear suspicious and to shift attention away from the true perpetrator. Who would have motive to harm both Victoria Hammond and James Whitmore? Inspector Carlton asked. Who would benefit from the destruction of both of them? This was the crucial question, and Miss Marple had been considering it carefully throughout the evening. She had begun to compile a list of people who had been affected by Victoria Hammond's fraud, people who had been harmed, financially or professionally. She had reviewed the guest list for the festival, considering who among the attendees had particular reasons to wish harm upon either Victoria Hammond or James Whitmore. And then she had remembered something that Eleanor Carlyle had mentioned in passing during one of their conversations. Eleanor had spoken about a particular collector who had been defrauded of a substantial sum of money, a collector who had purchased multiple bottles bearing false labels from Victoria Hammond, who had subsequently discovered the fraud, and who had lost significant money as a result. This collector, Miss Marple explained to Inspector Carlton, was registered as an attendee at the festival, though he had been relatively quiet and unobtrusive during the events. His name was Richard Ashford, and he was a wealthy industrialist from Surrey who had invested heavily in wines as a financial hedge and as part of his personal collection. He had apparently lost more than £100,000 through his purchases of fraudulent bottles from Victoria Hammond. Moreover, Miss Marple continued, Richard Ashford had another connection to this matter. His sister was Catherine Ashford, the professional wine taster, who had detected the methanol in the poisoned wine. Catherine had not recognised the connection, because Richard typically kept his personal business entirely separate from his sister's professional life. But Richard would have had knowledge of the fact that Catherine would be attending the festival as one of the expert tasters for the blind tasting. Inspector Carlton began to understand the implications of what Miss Marple was suggesting. If Richard Ashford was indeed the true perpetrator, if he had orchestrated the poisoning as a way to harm both Victoria Hammond and James Whitmore, then he had done so knowing that his sister would be present at the tasting, knowing that she would potentially be exposed to the poisoned wine. This suggested either a callous disregard for his sister's safety or a more complex motivation. "We need to speak with Richard Ashford immediately," the inspector said, rising from his chair. "We need to determine whether he had access to the storage facility, whether he had contact with James Whitmore before the poisoning, and whether he had motive beyond his financial loss to harm both of these people." But Miss Marple held up a hand to stop him. "Before we accuse anyone, Inspector, we must gather more evidence. We must understand not only what occurred, but why it occurred, and we must ensure that our conclusions are based on solid facts rather than speculation. I believe that if we examine the matter more carefully, if we consider the timeline of events and the interactions between the various parties involved, the truth will become clear." Over the following hours, Inspector Carlton and Miss Marple conducted a careful investigation. They examined the security arrangements for the storage facility, determining who had been granted access to the keys. They reviewed the records of the festival to determine when various guests had arrived and what they had been doing during crucial times. They examined the threatening note that had been left in Victoria Hammond's room, submitting it for handwriting analysis. The handwriting on the threatening note proved to be very close to the handwriting on several of Richard Ashford's hotel registration documents. The analysis suggested that Richard was almost certainly the author of the note. Furthermore, they discovered that Richard Ashford had approached Michael Prescott on the day before the poisoning had occurred, offering to personally deliver a bottle of wine to the storage facility, claiming it was a personal contribution from a private collector. Michael Prescott had accepted this contribution without question, grateful for the assistance. The bottle that Richard had delivered was not the poisoned bottle that had been served at the tasting, but rather the ordinary wine that Miss Marple had found in the storage facility, the bottle that had been used as a replacement after the poisoned wine had been removed. What this suggested was that Richard Ashford had carefully planned the poisoning. He had obtained methanol and had prepared a poisoned bottle that would appear to be a rare vintage. He had delivered this bottle to the storage facility by substituting it for the bottle he had claimed to be delivering. He had then left the facility and had somehow arranged for James Whitmore to become aware of the poisoned wine and to become convinced that Victoria Hammond was responsible for it. The question of how Richard had manipulated James Whitmore remained partially unclear until Miss Marple had a conversation with Michael Prescott. Michael admitted that he had mentioned to James Whitmore in passing that Victoria Hammond had contributed several particularly valuable bottles to the blind tasting, bottles that she had described as exceptionally rare. He had done so innocently enough, simply making conversation, but James had apparently seized upon this information as confirmation of his suspicion that Victoria was planning to perpetrate some form of fraud during the tasting. This is where the true evil of Richard's plan becomes evident, Miss Marple explained to Inspector Carlton. He recognised that James Whitmore was already angry, already desperate, already contemplating some form of action against Victoria Hammond. By providing James with the means and the suggestion for the poisoning, by ensuring that James would be in a position to execute the plan, Richard had turned James's rage into an instrument for his own revenge against both Victoria Hammond and James Whitmore himself. For Richard's plan had been designed to destroy both of them. The poisoning would expose Victoria's fraud and would result in her criminal prosecution. The fact that James Whitmore could be linked to the poisoning would destroy his reputation further and would result in his own criminal charges. Richard would be free from suspicion, having been merely a fellow victim of Victoria's fraud, and both of the people he blamed for his financial loss would be destroyed. Chapter 7. The Final Pieces. When confronted with the evidence, Richard Ashford initially attempted to deny his involvement in the poisoning. But as Inspector Carlton presented each piece of evidence, as he outlined the timeline and the sequence of events, Richard's composure gradually crumbled. He finally admitted to poisoning the wine, to manufacturing the methanol-laced bottle, and to manipulating James Whitmore into serving it at the festival. His motivation, as Miss Marple had suspected, was financial loss and the desire for revenge. He had trusted Victoria Hammond's recommendations implicitly, had purchased multiple bottles of supposedly rare wines at extraordinary prices, only to discover that the bottles were fraudulent, that he had been deceived, and that his losses were substantial. The financial loss itself, however, was not his only grievance. Richard had also suffered a profound loss of face in his social circles. He had represented himself to other collectors as someone with expert knowledge of fine wines, had recommended bottles to friends and associates based on Victoria Hammond's advice, and had effectively been party to the deception without realizing it. When the fraud was discovered, when it became public knowledge that he had been deceived and that he had unknowingly deceived others, the embarrassment and shame had been profound. As for James Whitmore, Richard harboured an almost irrational anger toward him, anger that had been fueled by the fact that Whitmore's vineyard name had been used in connection with the fraud, that Whitmore had presumably known about the fraud or should have known about it, and that Whitmore had not taken more decisive action to stop Victoria Hammond's schemes earlier. This was not rational thinking, as Miss Marple observed, but it was thinking that had been shaped by Richard's anger and his sense of betrayal. "What truly horrifies me about this situation," Miss Marple said to Inspector Carlton, as they reviewed Richard's confession, "is the callousness with which Richard endangered his own sister's life. Catherine was present at the tasting, and she could have consumed the poisoned wine. Richard must have known this, must have realized that his sister could be seriously harmed or killed by his actions. And yet, he proceeded with his plan anyway. This suggests a depth of moral corruption that goes far beyond financial crime, or even attempted murder. This suggests a person whose capacity for rational thought has been overwhelmed by rage and the desire for revenge. Over the following days, as the investigation concluded and the legal machinery began to move forward, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the events that had unfolded. 3 people had engaged in serious crimes. Victoria Hammond had perpetrated extensive fraud, deceiving wealthy collectors and restaurants, damaging the reputation of James Whitmore, and enriching herself substantially through her criminal scheme. James Whitmore had been driven by anger and a desire for revenge to poison a bottle of wine, an action that could have resulted in serious harm or death to innocent people. And Richard Ashford had orchestrated a scheme of manipulation and attempted murder, turning James Whitmore's rage into an instrument for his own purposes. Each of them had been motivated by different forces. Victoria's fraud had stemmed from ambition and a desire to establish herself as an expert without having the legitimate means to do so. James's rage had been rooted in the destruction of his family's reputation and his fear of financial ruin. Richard's revenge had been driven by the combination of financial loss and wounded pride. The wine festival, which had begun with such elegance and promise, had become the stage for the playing out of these darker human motivations. The wines that people had gathered to taste and to celebrate had become, in the end, merely the backdrop for a drama of deception, anger, and the desire for retribution. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. Miss Marple was invited by Inspector Carlton to participate in a final meeting at which all three of the guilty parties would be informed of the charges against them and of the evidence that had been gathered. This meeting took place in a private room at the police station, with solicitors present for each of the accused, with the inspector present, and with Miss Marple observing from the background. When Victoria Hammond was informed of the evidence linking her to the fraud, she seemed almost relieved, as if she had been carrying the burden of her deception for so long that being forced to acknowledge it was somehow liberating. She confessed to the full extent of the fraud, describing how she had systematically mislabeled wines, how she had built relationships with collectors and restaurants through the recommendations of these fraudulent bottles, and how the financial rewards had been substantial enough to sustain her ambitious lifestyle. "I knew it was wrong," she said to Inspector Carlton. "I've always known that it was wrong. But I believed that I could control the situation, that I could manage the deceptions, that no one would ultimately be harmed because the wines themselves were still of adequate quality, even if they were not the rare and expensive vintages that I claimed them to be. I was foolish, and I was arrogant, and I deserved to be exposed." James Whitmore's response was more tortured. He seemed to struggle with the reality of what he had done, with the fact that he had allowed himself to be manipulated into poisoning wine, with the knowledge that his actions could have resulted in serious harm or death to innocent people. His remorse was evident, though remorse could not undo what he had done, could not absolve him of responsibility for his actions. "I cannot justify what I did," he said quietly. "I was angry, and I was desperate, and I was not thinking clearly. But that is no excuse. I made a conscious choice to poison the wine, and I must face the consequences of that choice. I only hope that the court recognizes that I was not acting alone, that I was manipulated and encouraged by someone else, even though ultimate responsibility for my actions rests with me." Richard Ashford's response was entirely different. He was defiant, angry, and seemingly unrepentant. He insisted that Victoria Hammond's fraud had driven him to desperation, that James Whitmore had been negligent in failing to stop the fraud, and that his actions were justified as a form of justice that the proper authorities had failed to provide. He argued that he had been the victim in this situation, and that his actions, while perhaps extreme, were proportionate to the wrongs that had been committed against him. This is where Miss Marple finally spoke, stepping forward from her position as an observer. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "you are certainly a victim of Victoria Hammond's fraud. You have suffered financial loss, and you have suffered the embarrassment and shame of being deceived. But your victimization does not justify the evil actions that you have committed. You poisoned wine with the intent to harm people. You manipulated another person into committing a serious crime. You endangered your own sister's life. These are not actions of someone seeking justice. These are actions of someone driven by rage and the desire for revenge, and they are morally inexcusable." The force of her words, delivered with quiet conviction, seemed to shake Richard Ashford. For a moment, his defiant expression faltered, and something that might have been genuine remorse seemed to flicker across his face. But he quickly recovered his composure, returning to his position of angry justification. Over the following weeks, as the legal proceedings moved forward, Miss Marple found herself called upon to give testimony about the investigation and about the evidence that she had uncovered. The courts ultimately determined that all three parties were guilty of serious crimes. Victoria Hammond was sentenced to 4 years in prison for fraud. James Whitmore was sentenced to 5 years in prison for attempted murder and for his role in the poisoning scheme, though his sentence was somewhat lighter than it might have been due to the recognition that he had been manipulated into his actions. Richard Ashford was sentenced to 8 years in prison for orchestrating the poisoning, for attempted murder, and for conspiracy. The verdicts brought a sense of resolution to the matter, though not entirely. Catherine Ashford had to confront the reality that her own brother had endangered her life for his purposes, a reality that caused her profound pain and disillusionment. The wine collectors and restaurant owners who had been defrauded by Victoria Hammond had to come to terms with the fact that they had been deceived, that their trust had been violated, and that their losses would likely not be fully recovered. James Whitmore's family had to accept that their vineyard's reputation would be forever tainted by association with the poisoning plot, that customers would remain wary of Whitmore wines even after James's release from prison, that the damage to their legacy might be permanent. The festival itself, which had been such a prestigious event, had become notorious as the site where poisoning had been attempted, and attendance and interest in future festivals declined significantly. Chapter 9. The pattern becomes clear. As Miss Marple reflected on the events that had unfolded, she found herself considering the deeper patterns that had been revealed through the investigation. She had learned long ago that human nature followed certain patterns, that similar situations produced similar outcomes, and that the complexity and sophistication of human behavior was often less about the specifics of individual cases and more about the fundamental motivations that drove human action. Victoria Hammond's fraud had been an act of ambition gone awry. She had possessed genuine knowledge and genuine skill, but she had lacked the patience or the willingness to build her reputation through legitimate means. Instead of establishing herself gradually, earning trust through honest recommendations and genuine expertise, she had taken a shortcut, had created a false appearance of expertise through fraudulent means. Her crime, while serious, had its roots in understandable human motivations, in the desire to succeed rapidly and to achieve status and financial security. James Whitmore's poisoning of the wine had been an act of rage and desperation. His family's reputation and livelihood had been destroyed, or so he had believed, through Victoria's actions. The damage to his mental and emotional state had been profound, and in his rage he had lost the ability to think rationally about consequences. He had allowed himself to be manipulated because some part of him had wanted to believe that action, any action, would restore what he had lost. Richard Ashford's orchestration of the poisoning plot had been something altogether different. It had been a calculated act of revenge, conceived and executed with methodical precision. Richard had not acted impulsively, had not been driven purely by emotional distress. Rather, he had thought carefully about how to harm both Victoria Hammond and James Whitmore, had manipulated the situation to his advantage, and had proceeded with his plan knowing full well the risks and the potential consequences. These three individuals had each committed serious crimes, but the moral weight of their crimes varied substantially. Victoria's fraud had been selfish and wrong, but it had stemmed from understandable human motivations. James's poisoning had been dangerous and could have resulted in death, but it had been driven by desperate circumstances and by manipulation by another person. Richard's orchestration of the plot, however, represented something more fundamentally corrupting, a willingness to manipulate others, to endanger innocent lives, and to pursue revenge without regard for the moral implications of his actions. It struck Miss Marple that much of the evil that occurred in the world could not be attributed to malice aforethought, to individuals who consciously decided to pursue evil for its own sake. Rather, most human wrongdoing seemed to stem from a combination of circumstance, desperation, and the willing suspension of moral judgment. People made choices that they knew were wrong, but they justified these choices to themselves by pointing to their circumstances, to the wrongs that had been done to them, or to the necessity of their actions. What prevented good people from descending into wrongdoing, Miss Marple reflected, was not some inherent moral superiority, but rather the maintenance of certain fundamental commitments to integrity and to the acknowledgement of one's responsibility for one's own choices. Once a person began to make excuses for their own wrongdoing, once they began to view themselves as a victim rather than as an agent with responsibility for their own actions, the path to increasingly serious crimes became inevitable. This was why she had been so firm with Richard Ashford when she had confronted his arguments about justice and victimization. His reasoning was seductive precisely because it contained elements of truth, because he had indeed been wronged, because he had indeed suffered financial loss and emotional pain. But the truth that had been wronged did not justify the evil that he had committed in response. The acknowledgement of his own agency, his own choice to pursue revenge through poisoning, was essential if he was to have any hope of eventual redemption or reform. Chapter 10. The wisdom of observation. Several months after the conclusion of the investigation and the legal proceedings, Miss Marple found herself back at her cottage in the village of St. Mary Mead. She had returned to her familiar routines of gardening, knitting, and observing the small dramas of village life. The wine festival incident had become part of her past, though not part that she would forget. She was sitting in her garden one afternoon, working on a particularly complex knitting pattern, when she received a visitor. It was Eleanor Carlyle, the restaurant owner's wife, who had been one of the first people to suggest that something was not quite right about Victoria Hammond's wine recommendations. Eleanor had written to Miss Marple several times since the conclusion of the investigation, and she had finally decided to visit St. Mary Mead in person. They sat together in Miss Marple's garden, with tea and biscuits between them, and they discussed the events that had unfolded. Eleanor expressed her gratitude to Miss Marple for her role in uncovering the truth, for her willingness to look beyond the obvious explanations to find the deeper patterns that had driven the events. "I have thought a great deal about this situation," Eleanor said, "and about what it reveals about human nature, and about the value of careful observation. You notice things that others did not notice. You ask questions that others did not think to ask, and through that process, you were able to uncover a truth that was not at all obvious on the surface." Miss Marple set down her knitting and smiled gently. "In my experience, Eleanor, the truth is rarely on the surface. People are complex creatures, driven by motivations that are often hidden even from themselves. Most people move through life with their attention directed outward, focused on their own desires and their own circumstances. But if one takes the time to observe carefully, if one considers the smaller details and the patterns that emerge when one takes a step back, the truth becomes visible. What strikes me most," Eleanor continued, "is that all of this pain and suffering, all of these crimes, could have been prevented if people had simply been honest. Victoria Hammond could have built a legitimate reputation if she had been willing to be honest about her knowledge and her limitations. James Whitmore could have addressed the fraud through proper legal channels if he had not allowed his rage to overcome his judgment, and Richard Ashford could have sought justice through the courts instead of pursuing personal revenge." "This is true," Miss Marple agreed, "but it is also true that most people do not see situations clearly in the moment. We all have blind spots, areas where our judgment is clouded by emotion or by our own desires. Victoria Hammond believed that her fraud was justified because she was providing value to her customers, even if she was doing so under false pretenses. James Whitmore believed that poisoning the wine was necessary because the legal system had failed to address Victoria's fraud. Richard Ashford believed that he was seeking justice because the proper authorities had been unable or unwilling to prosecute Victoria's crimes aggressively enough. Each of them had reasons, as they saw them, for their actions. None of them saw themselves as evil people committing evil acts. And yet, from a distance, with the benefit of careful observation and rational analysis, the evil in their actions becomes clear. This is why observation is so valuable, and why it is important to maintain a certain distance from the situations we encounter to avoid allowing our emotions to cloud our judgment. Eleanor stayed for tea, and as they sat together in the garden, watching the light change as the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the lessons that this case had revealed. The world was full of people who were driven by understandable motivations, by desires for success and security, by anger at perceived injustices, by the need to restore damaged pride and reputation. But it was also full of people who, through careful observation and thoughtful analysis, could come to understand these motivations, could see through the justifications that people created for their own wrongdoing, and could help to expose the truth so that justice might be served. This was her purpose, as she understood it. Not to judge people, not to condemn them for their human weaknesses, but to observe carefully, to think clearly, and to help others see what they had missed. Through this process, understanding could be achieved, truth could be revealed, and in some small way, justice could be served. As Eleanor left the cottage to return to her hotel, promising to visit again during her next trip to the region, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The complex pattern that she had been working on was nearly complete, and she worked with careful concentration, ensuring that each stitch was precisely placed. The pattern that had seemed chaotic and confusing at first had gradually revealed its underlying structure, had slowly transformed into something coherent and beautiful. In much the same way, she reflected, the chaos and confusion of the wine festival murder had gradually revealed its underlying structure, had exposed the patterns of human motivation and behavior that had driven the events. The pattern was now complete, the mystery was solved, and the case was closed. Justice, if imperfect and incomplete, had been served. The cottage was quiet as evening approached, with only the sound of Miss Marple's knitting needles clicking rhythmically, a sound that had become almost meditative in its consistency. She had spent a long life observing human nature, had accumulated a vast store of knowledge about how people behaved when they were frightened, angry, ashamed, or desperate, and she had learned that this knowledge, when applied thoughtfully and carefully, could help to illuminate the darkest mysteries and reveal the truth that lay beneath the surface of human deception. The wine festival was now just another memory, another case file to be stored away with all the other mysteries that she had encountered and solved. But its lessons remained fresh, remained relevant, remained applicable to the human situations that continued to unfold in the village and in the wider world. For human nature was fundamentally constant, driven by the same basic motivations and the same fundamental weaknesses that had driven people throughout history. As darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, as the stars emerged in the sky above the cottage, Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed out the window at the familiar landscape of her village. She felt a sense of peace, the sense of work completed and truth revealed. Tomorrow she would return to her garden, to her knitting, to her observations of village life, and if another mystery should emerge, another puzzle requiring solution, she would be ready to apply the lessons that she had learned, to observe carefully, to think clearly, and to help others see what they had missed. For this was the value of careful observation, the wisdom that came from a lifetime of watching human nature reveal itself in all its complexity and its contradiction. And this was the peace that came from knowing that one had done what one could to serve truth and justice, however imperfectly, however incompletely. The end.